Anything difficult where you have to think is good for your brain. If you ask Usain Bolt, how do I get stronger legs? Run. It's intuitive. But the flesh in our skulls, it's meant to think and feel. And that is the power of self-growth. And it's a thinking machine, it's a thinking flesh that you actually have to use or to protect itself, because it's an energy hog, right? It's 3 pounds, but uses 20%. If you're not using parts of it, it'll program itself to let those parts of the garden wither. So the diversity of thinking and the depth of thinking, just one level past what you're used to, is the way to keep the whole garden flourishing. And it is a garden in there. There's chemicals, there are things moving, there are different types of brain cells. It's not just neurons. So I always try to give that metaphor analogy, if you will, that it's a garden and you have to irrigate it and stimulate and tend to all the corners, particularly the ones you're starting to neglect. Maybe it's your left hand. Getting out of the box and engaging the recesses of your mind is the most important thing. And then you have then the creative things happen. You don't just sit down and have them happen. You got to work and dream and go hard, and on top of that, something creative can happen. So now we have the understanding that the brain is meant to think. The brain is also meant to command your body to move. And absolutely, the minute you don't use your left hand, the right parietal lobe with the motor strip says, I'm not getting used much. I'll shave down that density of those brain cells a little bit. So that's where movement's important. So simple things like getting the mouse, using the mouse with your left hand and using your phone with your left hand. It's a powerful technique. And then the other thing is navigation. When you see old people and they lose their way home, well, that has a particular address also. Many things are global in the brain, but navigation is in the temporal lobe, and they have dementia in that area. Navigation also is spatial awareness, is a function of the brain, and sometimes when we're on our phones too much, we don't have that. So my kids, I tell them, don't look down. Not religiously or adamantly, but try to just remember our route and just look up and see how far you can get. I think those habits will help us as we get less young. And those are practical things we can do during the day. And as far as the other element is brain training, it doesn't have to be some weird game that's not intuitive. I think brain training just means learning as a habit, one step past where you're comfortable. If you're reading it, you know it, your brain's it's an idle. If it's too hard, it's not even engaged. I'm not even gonna win this race. I'm not gonna kick it in second gear. So just like video games, just good enough to get to the next level, right? They don't hit you with the 5th level, the tilt level up front. It's level 1 to level 2, level 2 to level 3. And that's what learning is. So despite your knowledge and intellect, it's just that level right beyond you that is brain training. So you don't have to buy an app, you just have to challenge yourself and think.
Right.
The way I think habits function, these are my ideas, is that because it's such an energy hog, it wants to be efficient. So this whole myth about you only use 20% of your brain, no, we use 100% of our brain, and pictures show that. But to get things done, we might only use 15. To get something complicated done, we might only use 35. Otherwise, you wouldn't be an efficient animal or a human in the savannah if you couldn't really control this important, but not having it in 5th gear all the time is an evolutionary strategy, in my opinion. So I explained to my kids, okay, so then it falls into ruts, because efficiency is about ruts, like dominoes falling in a certain path. And the best way I can explain it is, as you grow, the brain, the way the electricity flows, the way the connections prioritize, is a bit like skiing down a mountain. It starts creating these electrical grooves of sort, where if you see something, you see a cliff, fear, it goes down a certain path. And every time you do that and you've reinforced it, it actually becomes less expensive energy-wise to follow and fall into that habit. So these pathways, these habits in our mind, these rituals, these things that are good for us, we want to hold on to those. But a lot of them have become deeply carved, routes down the mountain. And filling those in, burying them, and finding healthier ones is going to be an energy expending process. Okay, the effort will be harder in the beginning, and then as you create a new route down the mountain, you can condition yourself to having more favorable and constructive responses. That's the best way I can explain is why effort will lead to change, and your most effort will be spent in the beginning, and then you can change your emotional and cognitive responses by conditioning yourself to find a different route down the mountain.
Okay, you talked about something I'd never heard of before. You called it electrical plasticity. Is that what you're trying to disrupt?
Yeah, exactly. So
that's fucking interesting. So wait a second. So if I'm disrupting the electrical...
We're resetting it, changing the oscillations. It's not on or off.
What is that coming out of? Like, so in the heart, you can put a pacemaker and get it to beat on a certain rhythm.
Right.
What's driving that in the brain that creates a certain electrical pattern?
So you're basically, the electricity in the brain is shooting through hubs. So
Does this all come down to repetition?
Well, I think right now, repetition can ingrain a physical habit. But what we're talking about, just to go backwards on this, is if you look at a snake and you've never seen one before, a lot of people reflexively jump back. And let's say it's a plastic snake. First time you might jump. Second time you say, well, I've seen that before. Your instinct was tamped down by your frontal lobes. And those structures are our emotional and instinctive responses to our environment. They should be malleable by our thought. The thought of these giant frontal lobes behind our forehead should say to them, you know, just because you're angry doesn't mean you should physically reach out and hurt somebody. Just because you've seen a snake, you know it's plastic. You don't have to jump every time. Just because you're afraid of public speaking doesn't mean after a while you have to be afraid of it. So that it's not conditioning, it's a thought that tamps down instincts we feel are destructive or not useful. So when I see, going back to the electrical stimulation, when I grab a doorknob, sometimes I think, oh, you know, I mean, I should wash my hands. But if I grab a doorknob and go wash my hands 80 times, the frontal lobe is having a hard time tamping down those emotional hubs. And we can drill a hole and put a catheter into these subcortical structures. They're like nodules within the web of neurons. And electrical tickling of that will snap the patient out of this obsessive compulsive disorder.
Does
Not
it
always.
last?
It lasts.
Get the fuck out of here.
Deep brain stimulation. You'd love this topic, but depression, OCD, and obesity, the drive to eat, it can all be modulated, and they're all housed near each other. That speaks to what they are, is an imbalance of the emotional drive with the ability for the frontal lobes to tamp down some of these instincts. It's instinctive to eat. Sometimes it can feel instinctive to be depressed. And sometimes obsessive compulsion is a part of our brain, and it's a natural part of our brain. It's okay to have those feelings. When you have them too much, the imbalance isn't just electrochemical in those emotional hubs. It's the frontal lobes not accessing their potential to tamp down some of the emotions. To keep the flesh healthy, you have to irrigate it. And that has to do with your brain arteries. And since we already said it's not a ball, you know, it's these jellyfish, and they're moving and they're throbbing and they're pulsating and their tentacles are reaching out. There's a lot of space in between. And that extracellular space, outside of the actual cells, outside of the neurons, outside of the jellyfish, if you will, it's not just water. There's chemicals floating around in there. Now, dopamine might be just from tentacle to tentacle, you know. Serotonin might be this way. But what's in all the stuff around all those billions and billions of neurons? They're growth factors and minerals and chemicals that the brain naturally has. But there's also a soup that these billions and billions of neurons are floating in. BDNF is a key component of that soup that helps regulate the health of each of those jellyfish or neurons.
And we can trigger more of that through exercise.
Yeah, you exercise and it releases it, it showers itself. It's not like the thigh muscle sends it up to the brain. The brain says, hey, I'm feeling good, this is good, I like this. I'm gonna create a new rut. I'm gonna remind you feel good when you run. The brain will shower itself with growth factors. There are growth factors. The brain says, hey, you know, the electrochemical balance is better with those. So I think that's where you get the runner's high. You know, it's not just adrenaline. It's not, dopamine's a happy chemical. I'm jacked up, I'm on adrenaline. It's just such a complex ecosystem. And rather than feeling intimidated by that, to me, I just see opportunities on how people can, improve their lives.